Wow. So sounds like we've got 54 participants at the moment. Welcome everyone. Good evening. My name is Peter Politis, and on behalf of Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to the library's virtual author evening. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respect to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people of this land as the custodians of literacy, knowledge and story. Housekeeping. So you can participate in this live webinar by clicking on the Q&A button underneath the Zoom and typing your question on the comment. You may need to use your touch your screen if you're using an iPad or an iPhone to join us tonight. Also remember, you can actually upvote other people's questions if you really want them answered. I'd like to introduce everyone to the handsome Ronnie Scott. Ronnie is the founder of The Lifted Brow, and he's also a lecturer in creative writing at RMIT University. He's a two-time MacDowell Colony Fellow and a writer of essays and criticism. The Adversary is Ronnie's first novel. And before we begin the Q&A, Ronnie, would you welcome?
Would I like to welcome?
No, would you like to do a reading first?
Oh yeah, thanks. Welcome Peter and welcome attendees. And I'm so happy to be here. This is actually, as well as a Q&A with Peter, which I'm so happy to do. This is the launch of the book because it's the publication date. So this just worked out really well. And I would love to start with a reading from the book, The Adversary. So thanks for letting me do that. I'm gonna read a scene from not the very beginning. Page 45 is when it starts, and I haven't read it before, but I thought that it would be a good one for this because it is set at Fitzroy Pool, and it's a setting that comes up a couple of times in the book. It's the first scene at Fitzroy Pool. It's the one that people seem to remember when they read the book, and also, I guess, what will I set up? How will I set up the characters? The book, The Adversary, is about a really close relationship between an unnamed protagonist and his best friend, Dan, who he lives with. And at the start of the book, these two people have realized in different ways and with different levels of consciousness that their friendship will have to change if it is going to persist. And in order to do that, again, at different times and in different ways, they have kind of gone out into the world and met other people. So Dan has a boyfriend named Lachlan, and the night before they go to this pool, they meet a couple of other people. You sort of don't need to remember their names. I guess you just need to know that the narrator is very, very insular and doesn't necessarily want to be in this situation with Dan. He's kind of curmudgeonly in some ways. He's a reluctant person, and yet he's been coerced into going to Fitzroy Pool. So I'll read the scene. Before I let my membership to Brunswick Baths expire, a trainer had written on the whiteboard, "Remember, summer bodies are made in winter." It sounded like an old saw trotted out by some Scandinavian detective, waiting for the lake to thaw and divulge its many bodies, creating a grisly wealth of summer overtime. Now though, climbing the bleachers at the Fitzroy Pool, I saw it had a troubling meaning of a different kind. While I had been imagining this Scandinavian detective, other boys had been taking the advice as it was meant, girding themselves against sagginess and scrawniness and ready their bodies to greet the sunny world. Dan and Lachlan were already up there on the bleachers, perched on towels and gazing at me through their sunglassed eyes. Neither of their towels looked particularly beachy, but instead seemed lifted from some fancy hotel in the same thick royal green as their dressing gowns. I couldn't imagine how warm and lovely it would be to cover myself in these towels in dead of winter, nor how awful it would be to do this after exiting the water on a too hot, windless day, sweating and chlorined and sticky with sunscreen, squinting up at the gym complex that hulked over the pool. Like many aspects of Dan's life under Lachlan, the towels seemed like souvenirs from a weird other world. I nodded to them, saw a space on the tier below them, reasonably man-sized, and made my way towards it. To spread a beach towel on these bleachers was to perform an art. It required a keen eye for towel-shaped opportunity and no undue squeamishness for disadvantaging others. As I dropped my own scrappy blue-green spotted towel and kicked at it to spread it, the shape beside my towel rolled over and revealed itself, inscrutable behind its own pair of sunglasses, these ones dramatically large and bug-eyed. I paused mid-crouch. "Hey," I said. He paused too. "Hey," Chris L. said. I looked up at Dan and Lachlan. We'd already said hi to each other, but I was getting into the groove. "Hey," I said. "Hey," Lachlan said. My sunglasses were always cheap, and the last ones I'd bought had broken several months ago. There was nothing left to say and nothing left to do but take off my shoes and shirt so as to complete the sense of exposure. There were more gaps on the bleachers than it looked from below, but it was hard with noise and dense with sizzly bodies. I was lucky to have found a space at all. Only when the American was halfway up the bleachers did I realize my terrible mistake. As if to reintroduce the idea of his Americanness, he was holding two burger shapes in Lord of the Fries wrappers, obviously having left the bleachers in order to pick them up. His towel draped off his shoulders in a pretense of modesty. He was flip-flopping up the bleachers in a pair of thongs. I held my hands out, palms up. "Sorry." "Hey, no friends in the towel game," he said. "This is Vivian," said Dan. "We've met," said Vivian. "Yeah," I said, rolling over and squinting up at Dan. "We are friends in the towel game." So his name was Vivian, which I vaguely knew was one of those names that was actually old-timey masculine, like Shirley or Evelyn, and only in the present world did it sound slightly deranged. Dan was in one of his unimpressible moods. "What's the towel game?" he said, when it was entirely clear what we were talking about. It was interesting how that idiom, "no friends in the X game," was something they must have had in America too, which only made it seem particularly pointless that Dan was pretending not to know what it meant. "It's this," I said, and said, "Chris L., would you mind moving your towel?" Chris L. swooped his lenses over the bleachers over the day. "I don't mind at all," he said. I smiled at Dan. "Thank you, Chris L." And when he'd done so, I moved my towel, which made it kind of bunchy, but the towel and I were both still dry, so bunchiness was fine. "There," I said, and Vivian set his own towel down next to me, stretched it out as far as possible, and sat down where he could. I was very impressed with Vivian and Chris L. for going along with me, although I was unsure what I had been trying to demonstrate. "And that's the towel game," I said, and refolded my legs. Vivian passed a burger to Chris L. over my body, causing just a drop of mayo to fall beside my chest. We teetered on a verge made up of chlorine and the sun, now revved up and now satiated, now tired, now flushed. We were parched and oily. We were sun-drunk. I was very happy to have found my new friends, but I wondered if I liked them mainly because they were not really talking and because all I had to do in order to be their friend was sit between them and also not talk. "So," said Vivian, "how do you know Chris L.?" Chris L. looped into a little pretzel of social watchfulness, unknowable behind the bright black surface of his shades, but projecting a freaky total awareness. "We're friends," said Chris L. simply. Chris L. whipped his neck dramatically towards Dan. "Vivian's from New York," he said. "Well, I live in New York," said Vivian. I died inside and curled over into a toothpaste worm, covering my ears as totally as possible without looking obvious and rude. I'd always thought my ideal boyfriend would live in a hard-to-reach location, on a voyage or in a jail. Imagine having a boyfriend who lived in New York always, a hard-to-reach location if there ever was one. The idea was powerful and stupid. Was this what a crush felt like? Brainless and harsh. It felt right and wrong at the same time, which meant it had to be wrong. I couldn't like Vivian. We'd barely said 6 words. I just hadn't slept with someone in a very long time, and wet cement and chlorine had a provoking quality. I had to do something before I did something more drastic, like find a strange excuse to lean over and touch his leg. "Chris L.," I said, interrupting him mid-sentence. He'd been saying something about guys here or guys there, but when I held out my hand, he tilted his head towards it. He took it decisively. His mouth went very firm. It was the first time in a long time that I'd held someone's hand, and I was surprised at its dryness and its toughness. "Where are we going?" he asked me. We walked down the bleachers. The day was hot, the walk was short, then we were at the water. He jumped into the pool. He came up for air laughing and saying something else. But I was already walking back up the bleachers, looking up at Vivian, who was looking at me.
Applause, applause, applause. That was so wonderful. This is kind of like the official launch of your book, because this is the day this is the publication date and the day it'll be in shops. Now, before we get into this like a foppish ingenue protagonist that you've created, there is really, really charming, really, really endearing. And I want to get into character a bit later. Can you tell us a bit about your writing process? Because I know for a fact that you got a Osco grant a really long time ago for this book, and it just took you ages and ages to kind of bring it to light. Is that fair?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. No, it did take me ages and ages. I think maybe because I had been mostly a writer of non-fiction, I like when you do that, you know a lot of the mechanics of writing, like you know things like structure and you know kind of various ways to get yourself through a piece of text. You know how to kind of develop an idea. But what I really had to do when I decided that I wanted to write a novel was I had to figure out things like, like character and theme and plot, and how to, I guess, how to build a narrator that could be sort of aware, in some ways self-aware, in some ways present for a reader, but in other ways, like you always want this kind of other presence in the text, which is like the author or the structure of the book, and that's somehow in touch with the reader as well. And I think that that's something that wasn't native to me, but which is really important in fiction in a way that it isn't in at least all kinds of nonfiction. And it just took me like a ton of trial and error. So it's a really short book, like it would only take a few hours to read, but there was just a lot of work, maybe as well because I'm not a very good conceptual thinker. I think I kind of need to think through doing and through writing. So initially, like I think I wrote a short story in like late 2013 even, which ended up kind of being extended into something that was book length, but it only had 3 characters. And I think I used that to figure out what the basis of the book was. And then there's like a lot of time that you have to spend away from it thinking, well, what is this really about? Like, what do I really mean? I just got stuck at lots of points, and I often had to like write the whole thing again before I really knew what the mechanics of it were. So
But here's another question, right? I've told you before, we've had this conversation where I've talked about how I plan what I write. You don't plan what you write at all, right? You just write. Is that fair to say? And can you tell us why that is?
yeah, because I try to plan, and it actually what I do is probably something between planning and writing, where I will always have like a little script of what has to happen next. But if I plan too far ahead, I just think that what actually happens when you're putting one sentence after another ends up taking you somewhere really different. So you always need a sense of where you're going, but you also need to be pretty willing to abandon that plan. And like, I shouldn't say you, because like you said, you write really differently, but at least for me, I always need to think that I know where I'm going, but also to try to pay attention to where I have actually gone.
Cool. Can you tell us a bit about like the landscape of this, of where it's set? Because it's set in inner North Melbourne, so it's you said made a really small setting of where all the action happens, and it's kind of like a community within a community. So it's kind of like gays, but like hipster gays, and then it's like hipster gays that live on a certain street, and hipster gays that don't live a certain suburb. Could you expand on why you specifically chose that area?
Yes, I can. So it's set in a house. It's set in a house in Brunswick that is actually a composite of 3 different houses, one of which is in Brunswick on or nearby the street where the book is set, which is Park Street in Brunswick, between Lygon Street and Sydney Road. It's a 2-story townhouse. And that house, which I stayed in once when I visited Melbourne in 2005 or something like that before I moved here. And so I think that house became sort of an Uber version of this city that I eventually kind of moved to and made my home. And so maybe it sort of became the house of my imagination. And then I combined it with a house where some friends were living in Fitzroy while I was actually writing the book. And then I combined it with, and I only realized this way later, another house that I visited twice in 2009 or something. But it's this, but that house as well was in Fitzroy. So it's this inner north of Melbourne kind of area that I think I experienced in a really different way to the characters in the book, because the characters in the book live in this very sort of narrow, deliberately narrow little world, which is very gay, as you say. Like there's only 6 characters in the book. There's really only 2 characters in the book. There's the main character and his best friend. And then there's 4 other characters who were kind of built to show like different models of friendship. That was how the plot was designed. And the protagonist would be kind of 2021. And I had a very different experience as a 2021-year-old. I was in Brisbane. I was in an artistic community, which these characters aren't really. They're probably sort of adjacent to an artistic community. And I had a really different sort of mixed group of friends and didn't have that sort of one sort of intense, close friendship that they have. So for me, I think setting it in this area and setting it in that kind of milieu was like a way of, I think that when you're writing a story, often there's like an ideal vantage where you're a little bit inside the story and a little bit outside the story. Like you want some kind of useful idiocy, and you want some familiarity as well. And I think that I probably had that, like thinking about kind of 21-year-old hipster gay people in this area that I lived in, having a really different life and at a different stage of my life as well.
So even though you have written in the first person, the characters, some people, I know this is not really a literary question, but they're not that likable, like these 21-year-old hipster gays that you're writing about, and it is a coming of age novel, right? They're not that likable, not that endearing, but I kind of like them in a way because I like them in the way that people are trapped by social convention. And I think social convention is the most important thing that our main character tries to decode. And can you tell us why you created a novel that is essentially about social conventions?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I really like this idea of a novel of manners being actually like, you can expand this definition in tons of novels and novels of manners, but a novel of manners is something that is built around a social world. And the idea of it is that the world is built and the plot is driven by by observation of gestures and the changing meaning of gestures and the things that people say and what the subtext is. And, there are really famous examples of novels of manners, like Edith Wharton, but also there are things that we don't think of as a novel of manners. Like I don't think that you would call Monkey Grip by Helen Garner a novel of manners necessarily, but you can see that it depicts a social world, and it's a social world that for me was really interesting when I first moved to Melbourne. And I think as well that the way that a plot moves in a novel of manners, it's always about the individual and the group. And this character being at the age of 21, like the reason that he is so close to his best friend Dan in the book is that they have kind of hit each other at this moment where you really find your people. And that's a really intense experience. And it's called The Adversary because they are each other's adversary in some way. Like they have a relationship where they push each other, and they have a relationship where I think that you get the sense that they like each other and they mean a lot to each other, but they have also just totally like exhausted each other and run each other into the ground. But I hope that you get a sense from their conversations that they're trying to work out what their place is in this world, while at the same time sort of building their own kind of world because of the relationship that constitutes their whole life in the house that they live in together. So there are actually a bunch of different sets of social conventions at play. One of them is this idea of like a wider world and a wider society, which the narrator and Dan are both kind of going out into as the book starts. One of them is also like the rules of the society that they've created together, right? Like friendships have rules, friendships have expectations, like a contract that you set up with another person.
Friendships are a covenant.
Yeah, of course, totally. So there's expected behavior, and like there's moments in the book which I thought were really like fun to work with, where the narrator is almost like appalled at things that Dan has done. He feels like utterly betrayed by life choices that Dan has made that have nothing to do with him whatsoever. And I think that that's one aspect of his unlikability, but I think it's also really true to their relationship. And thinking about likability, I guess the book started to spark for me when I kind of gave them permission to be like a little bit crappy to each other sometimes, and to do things, you know, the kinds of things that we all do in our relationships, where you act out of self-interest, but convince yourself that it's completely like about the fidelity of your relationship or something like that. Yeah, so I think that the central drama being between Dan and the narrator and their way of trying to belong to these kind of wider concentric circles around them that keep happening throughout the book.
One thing that really got to me was this idea of the gay guy who is, you know, a bit horrible, but doesn't have this sense of place. Now, I have a theory that there's actually a really long history of homosocial relationships in literature that are obviously conflict orientated, that are as close as they are as people, there is an element of competition, right? Did you tease this out, this element of competition, or you know, this because you know, we've talked about this thing before about how gay men, you know, you have the double patriarchy, the triple patriarchy, and because of that you get into this hyper competition. So what I'm asking you is, how did kind of masculinity, and how did the performance of masculinity and the performance of specific gay male masculinity construct the narrative flow of this for you, and have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I was just realizing that I think the last time I heard the word hyperpatriarchy was the last time I spoke to you. It's a really great word. I think that weirdly, like, even though it's sort of a big demographic move in the composition of the novel to have basically like 6 gay characters driving the story, it was strangely something that I kind of came to early on in the writing. Like, I knew pretty early on that, like, if you had characters with a bunch of different genders in a story, like, that is a way of writing about gender. But I also knew that I could do something really interesting by having like essentially this like 2-person story structure, and then like slight variations on those characters kind of as you moved out. And that means that I think you do end up talking about gender. You also end up talking about masculinity specifically. I think that one idea that I thought about as I went through the book is this idea of, I've heard it called heteropolarity, the idea that within gay relationships, we find lots of different ways to sort them according to like male-female gender dynamics. And that's really like, you know, there are different reasons that that's appealing to straight people watching a gay relationship. There are also reasons that that's appealing to gay people within a majority straight society. And so Dan is an HIV positive character. And one of the things that really informed my thinking about that was a book called Positive Images by an Australian writer named Dion Kagan, who we both know. He's a brilliant critic. It's called Positive Images, Gay Men, HIV, and the Culture of Post-Crisis. And he talks about a bunch of different representations of HIV positive characters after antiretrovirals, so 1996. And he has this great chapter called, I think it's called Positive Men Are from Mars, Negative Men Are from Venus, or the other way around. I don't really remember. But it's about like HIV polarity, and this idea that that depicting an HIV positive person and an HIV negative person in a relationship, even though it seems so gay specific, like, he analyzes different things that he calls seromelodrama, where like having an HIV positive person, HIV negative person actually makes it like an ideal, almost like romantic obstacle that works in traditional storytelling structure and has like all of these gender conventions. So I thought that was really interesting, the way that gender dynamics can play out between 2 men in a story.
That is really interesting. Now, I think one of the things that I think gay literature has always kind of had to deal with was, we've always had a really long tradition of the transgressive a gay literary novel. So you have stuff like, you know, the gay monster, you know, firstly our bodies were criminalized, and then, you know, HIV happened, and then, you know, literally our blood was, you know, like this source of poison, and we became these kind of monsters, right? And so a lot of gay literature has been transgressive, and we've recently seen an emergence of kind of like a correction where homophobia and stigma is no longer issues within some certain queer books, specifically men of a certain race and class, right? How do you think because I think there's other books that have that are in this genre. How do you think your book fits into that? And could you tell it? And when you were writing this book, right, did you actually think, hey, how am I gonna speak to the queer literature that's come before me?
That's such a good question. Well, that's lots of questions all at once. Which is not a bad thing. I'm just trying to think what part to answer. Could you narrow it slightly, actually?
Yeah, did you have a think about queer literature, or gay, specifically gay cis male literature, and the context that you're writing within?
Yeah, I did. I think like being being a being a fan of fiction and being a fan of the novel, which is my favorite form, like is my favorite thing to do, like recreationally is my favorite thing to think about. And it was really fun to work out how to write a novel. You actually have this very strange sort of doubled history, like when you look back at the 20th century, of gay writers, but white gay writers especially, who are probably like overrepresented when you think about how many there are in the world versus how many there are in the history of the novel. This is such a half-baked idea, but I'm kind of winging it. From different cultures and traditions, I guess, but mostly kind of European influenced, where you have someone like, I sort of I don't want to name names because I can't like talk about them in depth, but you have people who contribute like to modernism in this really like fascinating, amazing way, but not necessarily in a way that discusses sexuality or does in like a really kind of under the, like, you know, characters will be coded female, but you find out later that they were based on males that they knew in their life. And then you also have people who are, like, you find out are incidentally gay, but you've read 3 or 4 of their novels before and had no idea. Like, I have a bunch of different writers like that. So I think that this idea of like a tradition and a history of gay novels is really complicated and really compromised and really contingent, and often has a lot to do with what else is being written at the time. So for this novel, yes, like I thought really deliberately about the way that it could be a gay novel. I kind of thought, like, I have a friction in my head between like a novel and a gay novel. And I think that that's a friction that I try to resist and sort of like, you know, like push against productively. And you kind of think, well, I'm just going to make it really, really gay and put like a lot of those signifiers in it. And that's kind of the way through it, like the right way to address those feelings. I think that, yeah, but I also think that it's a coming of age novel and it's a marriage plot. I think that it's really hard for gay novels throughout history to have a marriage plot. And it was really fun when same-sex marriage happened in Australia kind of halfway through me writing the novel, and suddenly having access to this like history of fiction writing that has developed at the same time as this history of gay male writing that you're talking about. Yeah, and then there's all these other ways in which it's like contingent and compromised and based in like literatures from other countries as well. Yeah, that's all.
It's interesting we talk about the character's awareness of history, right? Because all the characters in the book, they don't have a background at all. But what they are acutely aware of is that they're woke TM, but they have a really good analysis of, and I don't mean it derivatively. I think woke is pretty cool because what's happened is we've made being progressive a cool thing, right? But these characters are really aware of their history within the context of HIV, right? And they're really aware of the marriage equality stuff. And they have very progressive viewpoints on that. But at the same time, they weaponize them against other people, right? And so can we talk about why those characters, you know, weaponize, and one scene that comes to mind is like, one of the characters was going to like pork someone, and then the guy literally asked or said the wrong thing, and he just walks completely out of there, and he's like, no, can't have sex with you, you asked, said the wrong words. Could you go into that kind of like hard-headedness and why that's an interesting character trait?
Yeah, for sure. I like when writing the narrator, I was really, really interested in having his wokeness or his sense of like his own context, like his sense of gay history and especially HIV, be something that like without spoiling the book, it's really fun to have someone weaponize their knowledge and like uh, their background and their like he's a wordy person like I am. Like he's someone who's interested in knowledge and reading and things like that. It's fun to have someone have that be the way that they get through the world, and then have them slip themselves up, which happens in I think like one of the sort of pivotal scenes in the book, maybe 2/3 of the way through, where there's a difference between kind of researching things and knowing about things and thinking about like a history that I guess this character has inherited because he's 21 years old. You know, he probably didn't identify as gay when he's 13 years old. Like it's a very recent history that he's obviously engaged in and in some ways proud of and in other ways oppositional to. And yeah, there's a difference between kind of knowing that and being immersed in it and in understanding what it is to be another person in another person's skin and with another person's blood. And that was for me a way to really get it. The fact that he and Dan are very close, but very different. And that the way to manage their friendship was to have like some recognition of their difference. So for me, I think it was less like a commentary on wokeness and much, much more like a lot of the decisions that I made about the story came from like always whenever I got lost, like going back to their relationship and thinking, how can I make that relationship like strong in the reading? Like how can I give it space to develop? How can I build in things like hypocrisies, or how can I build in things like, you know, like problems and gaps that you can then like give the characters room to move later on?
I want to ask you a technical question before we move on to some pretty good audience questions already.
Cool.
But um, how did you find the voice for this character? Because the voice is really, really funny. His observations are hilarious. There are moments where I laughed out loud, and I really, really like enjoyed reading the comedy of this book. And why did you make that decision to go into comedy in a certain way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think uh why did I make the decision? I think that comedy is like, sometimes when people talk about comedy and they talk about like, you know, people talk about like salty sweet in writing, or they talk about having a balance of lightness and darkness. And like obviously I think that there is some challenging stuff under the surface of the book, and my favorite kinds of books are books that have those kind of like little legs paddling under the surface, but also like a smooth surface. Sorry, I guess there's a duck on the surface in that image, but I mean like a smooth surface that gets you through it. But I kind of hate that idea of comedy as just something that is like a delivery service for more complicated ideas. I think that comedy itself is a complicated idea. I think that it's a way of like it's often a way of expressing something dark, or it's often a way of expressing something sad or contradictory. I think that comedy often works through surprise, through saying something that is different from what you've set up, but not so different that it's just absurd or senseless. And I think that when you're setting up a joke in a book, that often tells you a lot about what the expectations are of like of the social conventions of that world. You know, I think when you're making a joke with a friend, like part of the reason that it's really rewarding to make a joke with a friend is that you've probably sort of pushed it a little bit, like you've been a little bit transgressive, or you've said something that's like a little bit within the bounds of what you're able to say with that person, but just pushes it into a slightly different place. So it's a recognition of what you know and understand about each other. So I think comedy is really important in telling the story of a friendship. And I guess just when you said it was a technical question, I think when you have a book that has like a, you know, humor over here and like darkness over here, it just gives you a lot of room to move. You can kind of throw those things together in lots of different ways, and that's really fun to work with.
Okay. And here's a kind of question, not really about technical question, but about modes of writing, right? Do you think that a writer has a social responsibility when they're writing a novel?
I think that everything that we do socially carries a kind of responsibility to it, and I think that that comes with speech, like speech in kind of one-to-one relationships as well as public speech. I think that that all of our behaviors are in some way ethical behaviors, and so there's a sense of responsibility that attaches to that. So I think, yeah, I sort of know what you're talking about. Like, people talk about the novel as an irresponsible form, don't they, when they defend like what the novel can do. And I understand that, but I think that even if people are talking about the novel as a transgressive form, or as something that has like social permissions that we don't have otherwise, and people talk about comedy in those terms sometimes too, like, that's still a piece of art serving a social function, and there's still like an ethical ground there. So, like, yeah, I don't know, Deborah Levy, who's a really great essayist and novelist, like, she talks about the novel as something that is both a piece of art and a piece of entertainment. And in some ways, when you're writing a book, like, really all you're trying to do is get out of one scene and into the next one, and that's what you want the reader to do. And I fully, like, I totally sympathize when people say that the point of a novel is to finish, like, is to get someone to get to the next page and get to the ending, and it's to divert people. But I think that pieces of art can they can be discursive and entertaining at the same time.
Yeah, right. So you'd kind of subscribe to ethical models of reading, perhaps?
I don't know. Do you mean like the idea that like a book has an educating function? Or yeah, yes, I think so. But I also think that yeah, not exclusively. What about you?
Um, Look, I think one thing for me is that, like, I've just been exploring all these like horrible male characters, and when I came to your book, The Adversary, right, what I thought was really amazing about it for me was your book gave me a mode of thought into platonic gay relationships in a way that I've never ever thought about before, and that was a really interesting thing for me to think about platonic gay male relationships, because so many gay novels, including a lot of mine, are just about sex and about, you know, the partner or who the person you're with, right? And like you don't have any sex scenes in your novels whatsoever, right? Can you tell us why you don't have any sex scenes?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with the ethical model of reading, I don't think. Like, I think that like, if anything, when I kind of made the decision not to have sex scenes in the book, and there are lots of almost sex scenes, I kind of worried, like, would that be taken as like a moral or a moralizing idea, and especially because I was making so many of the edits through like the campaign for same-sex marriage, where there was a lot of discussion in the public sphere around like a neutered version of gay sexuality, and the idea that homosexuality was acceptable if it was not about bodies and sex. That was happening at the same time as I was kind of taking all of the sex out of my book. So I was thinking about that a lot. But really, I just thought that having like uncomfortable scenes where people can't communicate properly, and where sex is terminated, and where like mistakes are made, and you think that something will involve sex, but it involves blood. I thought that that was just a fun, resistant way of getting through the book that was really, really like suitable to the character. It made sense to who he is. I think he's a difficult person, and that was why he was fun to write. And that comes through when he is alone in a room with the other characters in the novel.
Yeah, he's a character. He's a pretty bad gay because he doesn't like human bodies. He doesn't like human fluid. He doesn't like kind of like you know, this the adventure of physical homosexuality, right? And that was obviously a deliberate strategy on your part. And do you think that that kind of renders more acutely the social world that this character inhabits and the social deceptions that everyone's engaging in.
Yeah, I do think so. I think that I mean, yes, I think that he's a bad gay, as you say, in lots of ways. But I also just think that he's just a person who doesn't like things. Like I just had fun writing a character who sort of has to be dragged through the plot, and then trying to find other ways to kind of lighten the story and to give it like a kind of energy, which doesn't come from him sort of being willing and moving through the story. And then when he does get motivated to move through the story, like seeing what a disaster that is and what a mess that he makes of things. Um, yeah, yeah, yes.
Even though my boyfriend is kind of like a prom king / kind of jock kind of guy, right? I'm actually I find like curmudgeonly characters just really, really endearing and hot. I think it's the gay nerd that you like. It's their kind of resistance to the world. I think there's something really attractive about kind of like the curmudgeonly nerd, the foppish ingenue. Did you like end up liking him at the end of the book, or did
Yeah,
you?
yeah, like, yeah, I think that can happily have a discussion about the unlikability of the characters, but I could also have a discussion about the likability of the characters. Like, I think that probably maybe because I'm thinking about his age as well. Like likability sort of almost doesn't come into it when I'm thinking about him. I think that he's like just in a provisional space where he's receiving information from other people and interpreting it, and that's kind of how he moves through the world and moves through the plot. Um, yeah, I tried to be careful not to judge him too much, but then but still, as you go through a story, like it was fairly hard to figure out how it should end, because that's probably where moral judgment comes into a plot. It's like, will things end well for you, or will they not end well for you? Um, and I think that does, like, it makes you realize that it has, I guess, been an ethical endeavor in the way that you suggest. And I think that when he got to the end, I made the decision that I liked him, because I think it does end well for him, but probably not in the ways that he wants or thinks that it will.
Yeah. We have some good questions coming through. Let's go to the Rebecca Kelly's question. So, how different is the ending that you expected, given that you didn't plan where it was going from the start?
Yeah, it's really different. I think that originally, thanks Rebecca Kelly for that question. Originally, like, it ended by moving further and further out into the world. Like more and more characters were introduced, and you sort of saw new ways of being. But I thought that wasn't quite right for a story that takes place over like 8 weeks, which it does. I thought that it was better for it to kind of contract and to sort of pair away characters, not pair off like couple up, but pair off like slice off and do away with. And that's just something that happened over time, I guess.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
yes, it ended up being a very different ending.
I want to get back to another question that I have, and this is a really hard question that you might have to answer, right? But none of the characters have histories, right? Because of the 8-week framework, right?
Yeah.
We don't know about their parents, we don't know about their blah 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 blah. They have no background, right? But they are, most important thing to them is landscape, right? And here's what I think. I think your book falls into the Australian tradition of characters that have landscapes, that are dealing with the landscape because of their inability to deal with their past. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, I think that's totally fair. Yeah, I think that, and you're talking about like collective past for these characters, right? Like you're not
I'm
talking.
talking about like the kind of collective settler amnesia that we have as Australian citizens, but at the same time, the kind of amnesia that gay men have in kind of trying to reform themselves.
Right, and I think that these two things probably, like, they intersect with each other in like totally amazing ways, because I think that sometimes when you see the way that like mainstream like gay male discourse like builds an idea of history. And you and I have talked about this before. Like it's really, really important to build, to have this kind of history building project for gay people, full stop. I think that the reason is that, well, there are lots of different reasons, but one reason is that often people kind of come to it, you know, after they have already developed a history in their family. They sort of have to gather it, and they kind of have to commit to it, and they have to articulate it. And I think that that's a really important part of identity. But then it gets really tricky, and I think like really like strange, basically, like when you're thinking about like the representations of gay men that we most often see, which are white, cisgender, middle class. And that's the territory that I'm working in this book. And this sense of like history building necessarily becomes a kind of history raising as well, not raising as in raising up, raising as in like a bulldozer. And that's like, yeah, I think that that's where so much of the source of friction in probably people's senses of themselves comes from. I think it, like, yeah, any sort of construction is also a kind of destruction. And mostly people in this world are self-interested, which means that they're always going to pick the thing that is constructive for themselves, even if it is destructive to other cultures. And that makes it really interesting territory to write about. And I think like I came to that, like, you know, talking before about gender in the book and how like I figured out really, really early on that I could do interesting things with gender by writing about a small group of gay men. Like it took me so much longer to figure out that they were white characters. And I think that saying figured out like probably gives me too much credit. It was more like I went through tons of different drafts, gave them to different readers, and eventually just had this amazing, like very generous, very critical sensitivity reader. And they said at some point, like I had characters who were very like historyless, like all of the other characters in the book are. Like you don't know the narrator's name, you don't know very much about anybody's family. And there were characters who were non-white at that time. And the reader was like, you know what, it's very, very strange that you as a white author have these historyless characters of color. Like that's very, like quite different from you as a white author having white characters that are historyless. And I think that like basically their point was, this is not the right way for you to engage critically with this material. Like, and I eventually figured out, well, you know, after sort of more experimentation, like the way to engage with it critically is to try to inhabit that compromised position and to sort of see what you can do with the territory that you have and that you're working in, which for me, like is maleness, whiteness, gayness, middle classness. Yeah, but I didn't come to that very naturally at all. It took like a long time of writing the book.
See, I think there's a real good lesson for you and your writing students that are, or any potential writers that are watching this, right? Like people have this obsession with writing the other and that the other is the most interesting thing. But if you actually just invert the gaze and understand that you actually come from a culture, that whiteness is a form of culture as well, you can unpack that in a really nuanced way, in a way that no one else can, you know? And I think this is where I think kind of like subjectivities of literature is becoming more and more important, right? Like your own, and exploring your own personal subjectivities, because every time we try and do something else, like we end up creating a more problematic representation, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that that like often people kind of frame the debate over what you can write and what you cannot write, like around ideas of permission, like the word can that I just said, but also I think ideas of like sticking to your experience versus going far away from your experience. But this idea of your subjectivity or this idea of your experience, like it's broader than what we actually think. Like the way that, you know, the discussion that we've just had about this novel, I think makes clear that it's like excursive and imaginative in lots of ways. It's, and yet like it's like that inside outside view that I was talking about before, where you're sort of close to a subject, sort of far from it. And that's like still an imaginative act. It's an imaginative act, I think, in the way that probably people think that they will get if they like try to write a character with wildly different characteristics or attributes than anything in their like immediate vicinity or their own history. So yeah, I think that it's not always as simple as saying like writing about your own experience and background versus writing about something else. I think that within those parameters, within the parameters of your own subjectivity, there are still like obviously ways to discover things and ways to push yourself.
Let's go to some more audience questions because there's some pretty good ones, right? First one, could this book be set in Brisbane?
Well, I don't think so. Could it be set in Brisbane? I mean, yeah, in some ways. Like I'd have to change a lot of it. I think that there are things that are like fairly like physically specific to the.
Would they be swimming in the brown snake? Is that what we're asking?
I think that there are. I mean, there are pools like the Fitzroy Pool in Brisbane, but I think that I tried to give it a sense of geography that did impact the plot, like how long does it take you to get from one place to another, and do you have to take an Uber or a cab, or like do you need a bike, that kind of thing. I tried to make it
Go deeper, because I think that there is like a specific link between a suburb and the kind of people that inhabit the suburb, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think so. But at the same time, like there are suburbs like that in Brisbane as well. And I think that all of the like the queer spaces that I wrote about in the book, they're interesting to me because they're not purely queer spaces. Like even the Fitzroy Pool, which I opened with in the reading, like people go to the Fitzroy Pool who are not gay men and they do not experience that as a gay space at all. And I think that like all of the bars that they go to in the book and like, you know, thinking about the ways in which those things are queer spaces, but they're also not. I think thinking about like the hipsterdom of the characters, like the suburbs that they inhabit are like, yes, gentrified in some ways and yes, hipsterish in some ways, but they also have like whole other lives that these characters just don't notice or access.
Let's go into a really good question from Rebecca Harkins Cross. How did you balance representing a contemporary character with HIV in a way that tied into the novel's themes about intimacy and disconnection without turning HIV into a metaphor?
Thank you so much for your question, Rebecca Harkins Cross. I think that we, like, this is a thing with HIV writing generally, like as in critical HIV writing, is it always talks about illness as metaphor. Like there's a famous essay that talks about, oh no, it's AIDS as metaphor by Susan Sontag, but also like, I don't want to misattribute anyone, but I've heard it called the Plague of Discourse, the idea that that this particular virus can be made to mean so many things and has been, and that can have social consequences. And when I was thinking about HIV in 2020, and thinking about it, you know, to the extent or authority that I could, like, and also like things like Dion's book, Positive Images, was really helpful in thinking about it this way. Like the way that HIV operates culturally is just really, really different from its roots in crisis. And that has impacts on storytelling structure, like not just collapsing something into symbol or metaphor. I think that that if you're telling a story about crisis, if you're telling a story about you know, AIDS as it you know, was necessarily written before antiretrovirals, that's always about it's always about death, or it's always about like who has what or who doesn't have what. Often it's about disclosure even, and sorry, that's not just historical, like that's today as well. And I really wanted to write a story that was in some ways about invisibility and uncertainty and undetectability. I'm really interested in that campaign, U equals U, which means undetectable equals untransmissible. This idea that you know, often an HIV positive person will have an undetectable viral load, and that means that the virus is untransmissible. And I think that when you're thinking about how to shape a story so that it isn't necessarily kind of based in crisis and crisis thinking, and various kind of other ways that HIV storytelling could coalesce into story, like thinking about those principles is really useful. And I think that that's different from collapsing it into symbol or metaphor. So thinking about intimacy is like, well, what can we know about another person? How close can we be to another person? And what are the problems with that? Like, where are the frictions? Where are the tensions? In the house in Brunswick, the narrator and Dan, they share a wall, and the narrator is always in his bedroom, like trying to listen to Dan and trying to figure out how Dan thinks and who he is, and just really like wanting to be like more than friends with Dan, not romantically, but wanting to kind of share his personhood in some ways. And I guess, he doesn't have like an open line of communication with Dan for a lot of the story. Like Dan doesn't communicate with him in the way that he would like him to. And so there's a lot of like guesswork for him in figuring out what the scope and the bounds of their relationship are. And I think that's something that's kind of shaped around this idea of uncertainty and invisibility. And that goes back to trying to let HIV as a livable chronic illness influence the shape of the story.
Ronnie, have you written the first PrEP novel?
I am sure that there is another PrEP novel out there, but it was pretty like interesting to have that become something that was widely used in Australia halfway through writing a story that had HIV in it. I think that PrEP is really interesting. Again, like as something that you could easily collapse into symbol, but which like is just something that changes the way people think and live.
So you, in terms of answering that question, your concern wasn't really allowing HIV or PrEP to be metaphors. You were interested in the conflicts and the kind of plot and tension that would arise because of those as objects. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the way that the presence of this virus in all of its permutations changes the way that we see ourselves and see each other. And as we've all probably or may have noticed in the last several weeks, like a virus does have the potential to change a society. And I think that like even PrEP bringing, I think there are so many reasons that HIV has come more into the public consciousness in the past few years, and one of them is PrEP. But one of them is also this wave of like historicized stories about the AIDS crisis, which like again, going back to Dion, because I've spoken to him about this, he would say that that these crisis narratives are a way of demarcating AIDS as something that really clearly happens in the past, and that's an important way for a culture to move on from a crisis. But just thinking about, yes, like tensions, story shapes, but also the way that we feel our bodies and the way that we think about human relationships, like that's, the presence of a virus, of course, changes that.
So Dion's book was a real touchstone for you in terms of theory and applying that theory into your novel. Were there any other books that were really important for you theoretically?
That was the big one that kind of hit me halfway through writing the book, and it was the one that let like a lot of the themes of the book sharpen. And I think that, that's one of those books that like references a lot of other books. Like because I'm not a queer theorist, I'm a creative writing academic. Like you sort of end up magpie borrowing from lots of different fields and disciplines. And so there was a lot of like fairly like established AIDS scholarship and queer theory that I sort of came upon for the first time in Dion's book, and that sort of matched up with things that I was vaguely aware of, but it's not like I sort of did a course of study in that. So I think that I use theory and I use things like that in this book in the way that you probably use like lines of criticism or other novels that you read. You kind of let you let it act as an artistic influence the way that you let pieces of fiction or good sentences or interesting characters from other books influence your work.
I've got a question from Jess McKenzie. How do you think the narrator would be handling the current lockdown, given his curmudgeonly hermit tendencies?
I think that reading this book during I was about to say in the age of COVID, but which is such a hackneyed phrase already, but reading the novel in the age of COVID, I think that one of the strange things about it is that he is like semi shut in, like he really, really likes being alone. He doesn't like other people's bodies. He spends a lot of time on his phone. I think that he's kind of suited to it. But also like looking at that pool scene and how they are stepping over each other's bodies and how they're sharing towels, and there's scenes where, and you know, sharing burgers and things like that. I think that it's a really social novel, and I think that one of the things that the narrator doesn't know about himself is that he is someone who is closely involved in other people's lives and bodies. And that I think the resistance is more a part of his character than the actual isolation. So I don't think that he would actually do very well in isolation. I think that he would probably expect to and be surprised when he did not.
That's very cute, Ronnie.
Thanks for the question.
That was a really good question, yeah. I don't think I have any other questions I want to ask you. I want to see if there's any other audiences. I guess my big question is like one of the questions that I am asking you as a creative writing academic is you wrote in first person, but how did you find, like, it's kind of like there's a lot of exposition, right? The action, there's not much action because we're really privy to so much thoughts. And how do you create exposition that's interesting and engaging and something that, you know, you want to keep reading? It kind of like, you know, it's like when you read Narsgard for the first time and you're like, oh my God, this is going to be so boring, right? But somehow the writing that Narsgard does is it keeps you engaged and interested. What are the technical secrets you can impart to us about this, Ronnie?
I think, Peter Pilates, that a first person story is always about perception. Like, I think that different things can happen over the course of a story that push the story forward and drag the characters forward. And they can be external, like they can be things that people do. But in a first person story, like the reason to have something first person, I think, or one reason, the reason this novel is first person, is that like you start off the book kind of like this, and there's lots of room for error and mistakes, and gradually the story finds a way to expand. And so when you write a scene of exposition, like a character just describing things or talking about thoughts, you try to make some sort of action happen in that paragraph because they make a decision or they realize something about other people that gets them to the next scene. So it's a lot like being in a room with people and having another character say something that makes the rest of the plot happen. Yeah, you still have to have time happen in it. You still have to have the scene start one way and end in another way. I think that people sometimes think that like description contains no time. Like sometimes people think that it's just a thing that is there to set up an idea of space. But the way to make it active, I think, is to have the character discovering or deciding something as they go through it.
That sounds really hard. Maybe people shouldn't be writing. It sounds very difficult to do well, Ronnie. I think we're gonna wind down now. I want to say, Ronnie, would you be okay with winding down now?
Totally. Yes. You ask really great questions. Thank you so much. And thanks for reading the book in a really positive light and being interested in it and supportive of it. It's awesome.
I'm really excited about this book because I do think that it's kind of like a step into something else in terms of queer literature and gay, specifically gay cis male literature. I think it's a direction, you know, and I think it's really well written. It's really, really funny. You've got a beautiful voice, Ronnie. Not when you speak, but when you write. And I do think that a lot of people should borrow this book or go out and get this book. I'm going to read a wind down now, and then we couldn't be done. And I think this is like the official launch. I hope it is. And I think a lot of people have got a lot of stuff to say. Ronnie, do you want to do any other plugs for any other events you've got coming up?
Yeah, so next week there's a couple of streaming events. There's one with Chris Somerville at Readings Carlton next Tuesday night, which you can register for. And then there's a launch with Chris Olsen at Avid Reader in Brisbane on next Thursday night. They're both free, and you can find registration links to them online by going to the Penguin website or my website. Or the websites of Readings Carlton and Avid Reader in Brisbane.
Cool. Well, Ronnie, thank you so much for everything. It was a really great discussion today. Copies of The Adversary are available to borrow at Geelong Regional Libraries when the libraries reopen. And of course, many bookstores are still trading and offering online ordering. So make sure you kind of get that book mailed to your house because you'll have something to look forward to when you go to the letterbox. Geelong Regional Libraries is working hard to bring more innovative and recorded webinars and virtual events for children, teens and adults. So keep an eye out on their website as well. Thank you so much to Geelong Regional Libraries. You have been so wonderful to us. Thank you to all the participants that have participated in, and on behalf of the library, thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. Ronnie, you are so excellent.
Thanks, Peter. So are you.